At first glance, Bendy and the Dark Revival doesn't seem to leave much room for theorizing, having a pretty straightforward story and outright answering the questions its predecessor left behind through a literal slideshow presentation by the memory of Joey Drew, the guy who caused the events of the games in the first place. However, just because we're given answers doesn't mean those answers are 100% accurate, especially when those answers come from a notoriously dishonest individual. On the other hand, it would be somewhat pointless to include this if we were meant to completely dismiss everything Joey says as false. So I decided to look into things, and after doing some digging, I believe I figured out how much of Joey's versions of events is true. And if I'm right, then not only was the real Henry Stein trapped in the cycle, but simultaneously, Joey saying he made his own version of Henry isn't a lie at all. And it all comes down to one fact that the majority of the community has been overlooking for years. So grab your gent pipe and smash that subscribe button, because the date we've been told Henry left Joey Drew Studios is a complete lie. For those who need a refresher or aren't too familiar with the series, in Bendy and the Ink Machine, we play as Henry Stein, an animator and Joey's former business partner, until he supposedly left the company in 1930, 1 year after the studio opened. He then came back decades later after receiving a letter from Joey asking him to come back to the studio. Only it turns out that the studio was now infested by a whole bunch of ink monsters / people, who are very heavily implied to be the studio's former employees who were transformed by the Ink Machine, with all of them, including Henry, being trapped by Joey in a time loop called the Cycle. In Dark Revival, Joey explains that when Henry abandoned their work, Joey was so upset that he used the Ink Machine to create the Cycle with his own version of Henry trapped inside that he could torment over and over, only for a woman named Allison Pendle to inspire him to make things easier on the Henry in the Cycle through a character based on her, and to create a daughter, who we play as in Dark Revival. So instead of the actual Henry, Allison, and possibly other various employees, what we see in the first game are actually ink replicas based on the originals, with all of the real people off living their life while Joey had his angsty revenge fanfiction until he realized that he was in fact being a jerk and somewhat tried to fix things, right? The issue is this would mean walking back not only the audio logs from the first game that established souls were being used to make the ink characters come out right, but also the time Allison Angel calls herself Susie, how Wilson tries to use Audrey's soul to bring his OC to life only for him to get shoved into the character instead, and pretty much the entirety of the canonical books that back up that very same thing. So unless there's no other possibility, I'm very hesitant to just assume things were retconned, especially given the fact that the Meatley, one of the main creators behind the franchise, said right before Dark Revival came out that all of the story and lore from Bendy and the Ink Machine is still 100% canon, almost as though he knew that a lot of people would immediately jump to the conclusion that things got walked back upon seeing Joey's explanation and wanted to clarify that in advance. There's also the fact that Joey is well established to be an incredibly dishonest individual. Not only does he claim the characters Henry created as his own, and in his own memoir, The Illusion of Living, claim to value honesty, then proceed to offhandedly mention throughout the book many times he's lied, but the first game has literal writing on the wall saying Joey lied to us. Of course, I don't think everything Joey has ever said is false, but you don't spend every installment of your franchise establishing Joey as a liar only for even a memory recreation of him to be 100% honest. Or at least not selectively choosing what he says to make a good impression on his daughter. So just how much of what Joey said is true, and what does that mean for Henry? For a moment, let's go back to the premise of the first game. Henry left Joey Drew Studios back in 1930, and 3 decades later got a letter from Joey asking him to come back. Under Joey's explanation, everything after 1930 would be completely fabricated, just a story created for the ink character in the Cycle. That, I think, is somewhat true, but not for the reasons you might think. In the Bendy and the Ink Machine Employee Handbook, we see a page of notes written by Henry, including one asking to meet with Joey about leaving the studio. But what's particularly interesting is the letter sent from Pasadena, California, addressed to Henry Stein at Joey Drew Studios. Presumably, this would be a job offer of some kind that convinced Henry to leave, but that's not what I'm particularly interested in here. Instead, if we look closely at the date on the letter, we see that the last 2 digits of the year are mostly missing, but not completely. In fact, the tops of both numbers are visible, and while the 4th digit is curved as we'd expect, the 3rd digit isn't. Instead, it comes to a triangular point, just like the number 4. Not only that, but the postage stamp is one that was issued in the 1940s. It would not have been hard to use one from 1930 instead if that was what they were going for, which means this is almost guaranteed to be intentional. And since this letter is sent to Joey Drew Studios, this has to mean that Henry was still at the studio for some time in the 40s in order to get this letter in the first place. How long in the 40s, you might ask? Well, The Illusion of Living had a manuscript written by 1941, and in it Joey talks about how previous times people talked to him about writing a book, he didn't want to, but now he's absolutely willing to, and also Henry left the studio in 1930 and didn't actually contribute much in the first place, almost as though something changed recently, perhaps in the year 1940 based on the curved last digit on the letter, that he might want to write a book to cover up. Heck, even the guy Joey says supposedly replaced Henry isn't talked about very much, despite theoretically having worked as an animator at the studio for a decade and ended up overseas just before Joey wrote the book. Which is awfully convenient timing, especially when one thing that's established both by Joey himself and by Nathan Arch, who's writing editor's notes, is that Joey can and will fabricate people and stories about them for convenience, or just have a story to tell. And the evidence doesn't end there. In fact, in Chapter 5 of Bendy and the Ink Machine, there's evidence that not only did he not leave the studio in 1930, but he never made it out the door. After playing the end reel for Bendy, Henry appears in Joey Drew's apartment, before being directed back to the start of the game. However, if you hack the game, you can find a newspaper near a small version of the Ink Machine with the headline, "Local artist pushed himself too hard, found dead at desk." As far as I'm aware, Henry is the only artist who this would reasonably referring to from a storytelling standpoint, but what's especially interesting is that the headline uses the phrase, "local artist." Since Joey has this newspaper in his apartment, I don't think it comes from California. The only reason why the headline would call Henry a local artist would be if Henry never left, and instead died at the studio before he was able to leave. Combine that with Henry receiving the letter while at the studio in 1940, and suddenly there's the very real possibility that Henry was working at the studio while the Ink Machine was also there. After all, we don't have a specific date for when the Ink Machine was built, and based on Thomas Connor's 1943 audio log, he's been working for Joey for a while, as he says he's grown numb to the feeling of wrongness that comes with it. And while he mentions tearing down walls and putting in pipes, that doesn't mean that the base machine itself didn't already exist. Apparently, the Gent Corporation, the company Thomas worked for, has a policy that if something went wrong with a device, in spite of following their service manual, they would send an employee to work on the issue until it was resolved. I think that could be what Thomas's 1943 audio log was, and why he would be working at the studio for so long after that, which also means that the machine could have existed for a while beforehand. I'd also like to note that, according to The Illusion of Living, Allison Pendle is already working at the studio in at least 1941, and if we are to believe Memory Joey's timeline of events, he met Allison after the cycle had been created, though there isn't much elsewhere to back it up. Though with the whole situation of replacing Alice Angel's original voice actress Susie with Allison, and then Joey seemingly soon after manipulating Susie into a position where he could transform her into a version of Alice Angel, I wouldn't be surprised if this was at least somewhat close to the truth. Either way though, the reason I'm so positive that Henry's actual soul was used to make the Henry we play as is because even if ink creatures can be made stable without a human soul, Joey wouldn't have known that for a long time, and almost certainly not when he was creating Henry. When the first attempt to use the machine failed and the Ink Demon was created, Tom Connor told Joey that the machine was failing because the creations don't have souls. And since Joey is still using the soul method in the books Dreams Come to Life and The Lost Ones, which take place in 1946, I would be very surprised if Cycle Henry just didn't have one for whatever reason. This is why I think that the real Henry can be in the cycle while we simultaneously play as Joey's version of him in Bendy and the Ink Machine. After all, the ink is established to take a human soul and over time completely change the mind to match the character it was made to be. Boris is a perfect example of this. In the book Dreams Come to Life, we meet Buddy Lewick, a 17-year-old kid who gets killed by the Ink Demon only for Joey to extract his soul and create a new body for him out of ink. Except the new body is Boris. And throughout the book as he's writing, Buddy talks about how he's slowly forgetting everything and losing himself as Boris gains more prominence in his mind. And Joey definitely intended this, since when Buddy initially wakes up, Joey tries to appeal to the Boris part of him to get Buddy to go to some undisclosed location. By the time we meet him in Bendy and the Ink Machine, he's just Boris. There isn't much indication that he was ever anything else other than this lovely thing on his wall that looks like someone took scraps of paper and made something that looked vaguely like a person out of them. Funnily enough, this is exactly what happens in the game Boris and the Dark Survival, and the cutscene that plays when you interact with it says Boris sees a glimpse of the man he used to be, but then it's gone. This is why I don't think Joey was lying about creating his own version of Henry. When Henry died, Joey put his soul into the Ink Machine and made up the story of Henry leaving the studio and coming back after 30 years. He then included that backstory into the Henry that came out of the machine, and over time, that version of Henry would become more and more dominant until it completely overrode the soul of the original. Joey literally turned Henry into his own version of him that would better fit the story Joey was trying to tell. In fact, Bendy and the Ink Machine shows this to be the case. In Chapter 5, Henry receives the seeing tool that allows him to read messages on the walls written in golden ink, many of which seem to be written by Henry himself. For example, the message that says, "I always fall" is in the basement Henry falls into at the end of Chapter 1, and there's a message by a Bendy cutout that says, "His dream, my effort." This message is also why I think it's Henry's actual soul and not some random Joe Schmo who got turned into Henry. I don't think that they would know that Henry was the one who actually did the heavy lifting when all they had to go off of was Joey's version of events. And it would kind of defeat the point of the whole local artist found dead at desk thing. While there are indicators that not all of the messages were written by Henry, such as the handwriting being quite different and written with a grainier utensil in some areas, areas, the large majority of them do line up with him pretty well. The ones in particular that stand out to me are the one on a mirror that reads, "Who am I now?" and 2 messages that say, "I'm sorry, buddy," with one written on a Boris poster and one written next to Boris himself. For "Who am I now?" I'd like to note that it says who and not what, which would make more sense if it was just commentary on turning into an ink person. Even if the quote-unquote character that Henry got turned into was a version of himself, he would definitely have noticed how it conflicted with who he originally was, especially if he came out of the machine looking like he would if Joey's story of him leaving for 30 years was actually true. I'd bet Henry was pretty shocked when he looked in the mirror and saw that he looked decades older than he was supposed to be. Combine that with the version Joey wrote slowly overtaking his mind and messing with his memories like Boris did with Buddy, and I think that's more than enough to warrant the question, who am I now? As for the "I'm sorry, buddy" messages, if Henry's been stuck in the cycle since 1940, he absolutely would have been there when Buddy was turned into Boris in 1946. And since Buddy did remember who he was for some amount of time after his transformation, I find it completely possible that in earlier iterations of the cycle, Buddy was able to tell Henry his name, and that's why he writes "I'm sorry, Buddy" instead of "I'm sorry, Boris." Eventually, though, they both lost their original selves and all associated memories to the ink, fully becoming the characters they were made to be. Even the memories they'd gained before the full transformation took effect are shown to not carry over into their characters. When Buddy's mental transformation was getting close to complete, he forgot what a book was until he managed to resurface from being Boris, even though he had been writing the book after his physical transformation had taken effect. I think this explains not only why the Henry we see in Dark Revival remembers the previous cycles, as shown by his explanation of the end reel to Audrey, but why he'd bother writing on the walls in the first place with that being the case. He knew that eventually he wouldn't remember, so he left himself notes for when he did fully lose himself. To me, that makes much more sense than Henry just randomly forgetting things every few cycles. In fact, I think that the cycle iteration where we start to play as Henry could be the point when he fully lost himself. We play as Joey's version of Henry, and we don't know about or follow the secret messages until Allison gives Henry the seeing tool in Chapter 5, where now Henry can follow the messages left behind by his former self. As a result of all of this, I think Allison Angel is in a similar situation. She would have entered the cycle later, as she and Thomas got married a few months before Joey Drew Studios closed its doors in 1952, but this absolutely leaves time for Joey to put the two of them into the cycle as another Alice Angel and Boris. So I don't really buy the presence of Allison in the cycle as Joey being inspired by Allison to be a better person. But why doesn't Allison remember who she used to be while Tom still responds to his name? Well, she tells Henry about how the ink can pull you in if you touch it for too long, and how it was because of that she met Tom. Based on how she also talks about being just thoughts in the ink until coming out of it, and later compares going into the ink to the idea of a drop of water being lost in the ocean, I think this accident played a role in the sped-up erasure of her memories. Coming into contact with the well of voices in the ink stripped away what Joey didn't put into her. Rest in peace, Tom, who gets to see his wife nearly sucked into the ink, only for her to completely forget their relationship. So how much of Memory Joey's statement was true? Most of it actually, but only from a certain point of view. Joey never actually tells Audrey that Henry left the studio, only that he abandoned their work, which is true, and that he created his own version of Henry, but he leaves out the fact that he used the soul of the original in the process. Similarly, Allison may have inspired him to eventually try to change to some degree, but only after years of knowing her, and not enough for Joey to not stick Allison and her husband into the cycle in order to give Henry an angel of his own. At least he didn't split Allison and Tom up, I guess. As for his statement about creating Audrey, I think he's telling half-truths here as well. It did take him many tries to create her, but based on one message Joey leaves behind, the issue he took with the previous Audreys is that they called him their uncle. We even hear from one of these proto-Audreys at the end of Bendy and the Ink Machine, asking her Uncle Joey to tell her another story. So what happened to them? Did he just recycle them until he got an Audrey he was happy with? I don't know. Either way, it's not looking good. So while I think Joey is being somewhat truthful, I think the evidence strongly points to him selectively editing events in a way to make himself look better. After all, Audrey might be a bit less willing to trust him if she knew he actually shoved his best friend and all of his former employees into the cycle deliberately. But hey, if you think something else, feel free to let me know in the comments. And real quick, for those of you who have Twitter, I need you to go to my Twitter account and like the pinned comment, a link to which will be in the pinned comment of this video for the duration that it matters. If I reach 4,200 likes on that post, I get a free U2's Bendy plush. And with how expensive groceries are getting, I would really appreciate not having to risk my financial stability for the chance to hug the boy. And if you're still here on YouTube, feel free to check out one of my other theory videos. The FNAF fans out there might be particularly interested to take a look if they haven't already. Don't get stabbed, and have a nice day.